All right, 2025 predictions for the video game industry. I got this question on my channel recently. Do I think it's going to get better? And the answer is probably not. What I think is happening right now in our industry is that basically the AAA game has died. I think that the cost of inflation and just a ballooning of the funds that it takes to actually make these games has made that cost so price prohibitive that they have to sell so many different copies and the market is so saturated now and consumers are not really okay with the price of the games going much higher. I think there's a certain price that people feel comfortable playing for a game, whether it's, 40 hours or whatever. And that price, I think, gets really uncomfortable at the rate of like $70 or something like that. I think $60 we've really reached a max that most people are feeling comfortable paying. Now, of course, we might see a situation like the mobile market where you have a very large user base that maybe doesn't pay at all, and then they are, let's say, balanced out by a smaller user base that pays a exorbitant amount, right? Which they call the whale or dolphin economy. I don't think that's going to happen in console. I think probably what's going to happen is a lot of these huge attempts at a triple A game, right? Like the Concords of the world, like I don't know the names off the top of my head, but there was another game that came out that was kind of fantasy themed, Lawbreakers. A lot of these like huge industry flops, I think that are going for kind of this triple A thing are going to just fail. And I think that what's going to happen is we're going to see a rise of double A games, which is to say a huge AAA studio that breaks up into a few smaller studios and then they produce games at a cost that's actually doable. Like, I think it's really hard for these studios to recoup their costs when the budgets are in the tens of millions. I think if they can make these smaller experiences, even targeting revenues of like 5 million, with the studio of, I don't know, maybe like 10 people, like something like that. I think that's probably where this industry is headed. And it's just kind of going to further, let's say, spread the amount of creators in our industry. So I think that's what's happening. The rise of the double A game. That is my predictions for 2025. I think, of course, there's still going to be a few really big studios. Let's talk about something like Rockstar Games, which is certainly an outlier. And they're calling, if any game had a claim to this elusive quadruple A, that kind of came up as a joke when a developer called his game a quadruple A in the context of, what was it, Skull and Bones, though, of course, Skull and Bones was, certainly a huge financial failure for that team. I think it's a critical failure, too. At least I haven't really heard about it. So I think, the games are just getting harder to make. And I think it's because the kind of games that people are trying to make at that level are just, the audience is not really interested in that. Like, I don't think they want to see these like prestige gaming. I think they want to see more and more of these kind of double A games. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about games like Dave the Diver, right? Dave the Diver is a game that obviously outwardly has an indie perception. Even some people put it in like an indie games category when that game is certainly not an indie game, right? It's made by a AAA, it's made by a double A team, right? Which is to say AAA talent on a budget and scale that's a lot more approachable, right? I think Obsidian has made a number of games that are kind of more in this realm, right? Something like kind of, maybe you'd say The Outer Worlds is AAA, but you certainly wouldn't say that of a game like Pentiment. And I think that a game like Pentiment is much more in line with kind of what is fiscally viable in this economy, both in terms of the cost it takes to produce, but also the end product being at a price point that's accessible to the user, at least the user base that we have today. So that is my thoughts on that. The other thing to talk about is kind of where the mobile market plays into this. And I have to say that I made a mobile game in a really good time that it was to make a mobile game. I think we hit the market in like 2016, maybe 2017. And it was at that point where I think there was, I don't know what the terminology would be, but like less incumbent gatekeeping. And I think now it's just harder than ever to kind of get your game seen. And that's the main issue, right? Like, even quality levels aside, you have these huge games like or I mean to say, like, it has a huge potential, like Among Us, and it just comes out and it kind of sits for a while because it's so hard to engage an audience when the marketplace is so saturated. And so eventually you have a spark where somebody plays Among Us, it gets streamed, and it becomes a huge cultural phenomenon that it deserved to be because, I mean, hey, it's a great game. But I think it's the case that there's probably a lot of games that are in that category of like just a great game that for whatever reason kind of doesn't, the spark doesn't catch. So my thoughts on that are, unfortunately, yeah, it is just becoming harder and harder to survive on mobile as an indie, and I can speak to that firsthand. I have to say the platform content moderation sucks. It's really hard to get your games out there, and I honestly don't see that improving. I was delighted by, I mean, this was a huge court decision recently where Epic, I think, was against the monopoly of Apple, and Apple made a huge decision. It wasn't court ordered, but they said, "Hey, if your game makes under $1 million or something like that, you're going to keep 30% of the revenue." Or sorry, we're only going to take 15% of the revenue instead of 30%. That's huge, especially when you consider that that's gross, right? That's pre-profit. And a lot of these studios aren't operating at a profit, right? And so that 15% of gross revenue is a huge difference. So I think that's a pretty big deal. But yeah, basically, long story short on that is I think it's just harder and harder to kind of make games on mobile as an indie. It's really it's a whole different market. So I think that we're going to just see more and more indies going into Steam. And if you're an indie and you're curious, hey, should I go with Steam? Should I make a mobile game? I 100% recommend doing Steam because the economics are just so much better. And for mobile to work, you really need a user base because the paid mobile app market is like dead right now. So you really need a free user base that you're monetizing with ads and all these other integrations. And the other issue with that is you have to constantly update the game. So I think that's all I have to say about that on kind of my predictions. I don't think that part's going to get any better, but I do think more and more people are going to be going towards Steam. And I think that in terms of the AAA games, they're going to be kind of breaking into these smaller and smaller studios. Do I think that the games market was oversaturated? Yes, I actually do. I think that probably we were a little overemployed in terms of that, and I think there is a bit of a market correction happening there. But I think part of the issue is just these AAA studios can only sustain so much manpower. So I think that a lot of the jobs that were destroyed and kind of the layoffs of the last 2 years, which have been, really quite phenomenal, I don't think a lot of those jobs are going to be recouped within the job market. I think there's going to be maybe new studios opening in that AA space, but I don't expect there to kind of be more opportunities unless people are making them themselves, really. So those are my thoughts on the new year, and I hope you're doing well. Peace.